Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let us several seconds to make sure everybody is connected and ready because we have a huge waiting room as well. Welcome everyone who joined in our event today. We are happy and proud to have the joint event with CFA Society Istanbul. And today we will talk on the very important topic on the AI. As the first start, I would like to invite to the word Ayhan Yüksel, CFA. He's the treasurer, he's a board member of CFA Society Istanbul, and the person who is probably most dedicated to continuous education and education committee in CFA Society Istanbul. So Ayhan, please, this virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. Good evening, everyone. First of all, on behalf of CFA Society Istanbul, I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar. Actually, this is a joint event with CFA Society Ukraine, as Anna said. I think this collaboration is a great example of what our CFA community is about. Bringing professionals from different regions, learning from each other, and staying ahead of the curve. And today's topic is very important, as we all know. We have all been experimenting with AI tools over past couple of years. We ask questions to ChatGPT, summarize some documents, maybe use Copilot at work. But I think we are now entering a very different phase. We are moving from AI that answers the questions to AI that can actually do work, multi-step, complex work. And we are here to discuss that topic today. So at this point, the challenge is no longer, can AI help me? It is, how do I connect these pieces into something that actually works? That's exactly what Agentic AI is trying to solve. And it is moving very fast. Today, we have someone who is not just researching this topic. He's actually building and testing these workflows in real investment contexts. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Brian Pisaneski. He's a senior investment data scientist at CFA Institute. He leads research at the intersection of NLP, sustainability, and investment analysis. He is actually the person behind the Automation Ahead content series at CFA Institute. If you have not seen it yet, I would strongly recommend it. It covers various topics about agentic AI in finance. And also he's building some open source tools through CFA Institute's RPC labs. The goal is to explore how analyst workflows will change in the age of AI. Brian has spoken in many different events, similar events, and he led different workshops on this area as well. So Brian, thank you very much for joining us today. We are looking forward to this session. I would like to give the floor you, but before, Konstantin, would you like to add some other points as well?
Just maybe a couple of remarks, if you allow.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, just to,
yeah.
I think it was a comprehensive introduction of our speaker today, and I just wanted to comment a little bit on how we perceive the LLM and as investment managers, and most of us are kind of lurked or maybe driven to the headlines that it would take all of our jobs, but before we succumb to that conclusion, I'd rather we'd rather pay attention what LM states for the large language models, and it was not originally constructed to deal with any sort of data sets and as such. So basically, it's like I would suggest that we just drop this doomsday scenario and just try to understand better how we could use this tool for operational efficiency and serving better our clients. And I think that Brian is one of the best experts in the world to talk about that. So Brian, your floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Konstantin. Thanks, Ayan. Thanks, Anna. Yeah, I mean, I think that's all we can really do is drop the doomsday scenario. Be very well aware that these tools are capable and they're moving very fast. But it's very clear that the finance domain expertise is really what gives people a leg up as augmented analysts right now. And that's all we can really do is learn about that. So hopefully today you can all learn a little bit more about how to go about leveraging those tools right now. Um, and let me just share my slides. Okay. So yeah, hopefully by the end of it, you will have learned a little bit more. There is, of course, that worry, and I think that that's ultimately what we have to do is we have to just dive deep into understanding them. So yeah, that's what I plan to do. So I think that there's still a little bit confusion about what is agents, how can we actually leverage them to do more than just the basic work within ChatGPT, within Anthropic's Claude. I'm going to dive a little bit more into the agentic stack, how you could start building with these tools, whether it's, in a coding environment, whether it's a no coding environment, but also kind of bring it back to like where we are right now, in terms of how we're using these systems for what types of tasks. And then hopefully can kind of give you a little bit more tangible, evidence or examples of how to integrate some of these tools into maybe not necessarily a broad sense of workflows, but how they're uniquely positioned right now for specific tasks, including things like customized portfolios. All right. So let's start it off with a little bit more of a background on what agents are. So there's kind of some basic building blocks of an agent. So we are all familiar with just a single turn LLM, which is actually not an agent. So this is original ChatGPT, where you have an input, it goes into the large language model, and it performs calculations and spits out probabilities, and it produces an output of the tokens, which are words, just generalized highest probability of words given the prompt that you gave it. Now, when the biggest thing that makes it an agent is probably when we add tools. So this gives it that agency, that ability to go out and actually perform a function, extract data, whatever it may be. You have to be able to give the large language model access to outside information besides just its underlying parameters that cause it to spit out words. Now, in order for us to make effective agents, we have to add more and more things. And this is where the context of the large language model comes in. So we have to give it instructions about what it's supposed to do. This is, of course, kind of some of the prompting, whether it's system instructions. Maybe we give it a tone. Maybe we give it some output format or some examples. Uh, all in the instructions can dramatically shape the output. In order for us to keep up to date. So these large language models have a training cutoff date that once they're past that training cutoff, then they don't have new information. So what did we do? Well, we created something called retrieval augmented generation that allows the large language model to go out and find information in what's called a vector database. And all that does is it just finds chunks of text that are most similar to what the prompt, the input prompt was, and then it pulls those chunks of text into the large language model's context window, and it better improves. So it's pulling in more real-time data, or it's pulling in more relevant data that it didn't see in its training data. So that could be the vector database from the information retrieval, but it also could just be the web. So once we added web information, we're getting more and more up to date. If we give it a memory, so this can be a short-term memory or it can be a long-term memory. So short-term memory is actually built into the context window of the large language model, where you'll notice if you're working in ChatGPT or Claude that sometimes it will save memories to its memory. All that's doing is it's adjusting the system prompt, so it's adding new pieces of information to your instance of the chat. So that's short-term memory, but there's also long-term memory, which essentially allows the agent to be able to potentially go and access an external database that you can log information into, you can pull information from. That's long-term memory. Um, and in fact, it allows you, if you do create a long-term memory, so a backend, you could port all of your information very easily across, say, OpenAI or Claude as well. And then lastly, to form that effective agent, we have to add guardrails. So we don't want our credit research analysts to be able to answer questions about who won the latest football game. So we need to put guardrails around what it is that it can and cannot do in order for us to get to the more effective agents. Now, there is some confusion out there, I think, about what is an agent versus what is a workflow. So both systems are agentic AI, but they're very different in the sense that they offer different benefits. So a workflow is a system that is a predefined step-by-step process. So if you give it the workflow a task, in this case, maybe you could create a credit research agent or agentic workflow where the first step is designed specifically to take the query of, the research it's supposed to do, and then maybe expand on it. Maybe it's going to ask a ton of different questions from that one question. Maybe it'll come up with a different search queries that has to go out to the web to execute. Well, that's going to happen then in step two, where it has access to different data. It'll have access to the web. It'll go out and say, search that information that it needs. Maybe it'll go to financial data and pull in that information. But the point is that it's predefined and it has a specific output that it's supposed to achieve. Third might be some manipulation based off of the financials that it found. So it's going to calculate financial ratios based off of that data. And then the fourth might be summarize all the information that it has and then put that into a report. All along, it's predefined, it's auditable, it's controllable, and if you build it right, which these workflows are being built in Python systems with tools that I'll get into in a second, you can also run evaluations at each one of those nodes. So you can stress test each one of those nodes. So you don't gain trust of its output just by a single interaction, which is what we do now with, say, Claude or OpenAI. You gain trust by coming up with really good questions and evaluating its output in a very structured manner. Now that's very different than an agent, which is what we've been working with. So an agent is one that basically you give it access to a reasoning model, a reasoning engine that can think through its thoughts, and you give it access to tools. You give it access to data. Ultimately, the agent can get a task. If it's the same task as credit research agent, then first it'll come up with its first step in the workflow, and then that might be to ask follow-up questions. Who knows? And that could ultimately lead to more questions, and then it will reason, okay, I've got enough backup, I've got enough information for me to go out and execute, pull out information from the internet. And so then it'll reason, it'll look, what tools do I have? Okay, I have access to the web, have access to prior analysis we've done. All of these things, the agent is autonomously doing on its own, and then it's going out and it's observing the output. And then it will observe the output. It'll say, okay, I don't have enough information. I need to follow up with more information. So then it'll come up with a plan for the next task. And then it'll go through this cycle over and over and over again until it's deemed that it has enough information or complete a task and produce an output. Now, this system is a lot less controllable. It's a lot less auditable. It's non-deterministic. If you haven't really figured out what it's doing inside, there could be a lot of biases, unconscious biases that you don't recognize. And this can be a big problem within the finance industry because we have high cost of error tasks. So where if we make a mistake, it could have very big ramifications. And ultimately, things like bias amplification. So we know that large language models have bias. A lot of it stems from, how often it's seen certain data in its pre-training also emotional bias, which can also happen in a system where it comes up with a task and the first part of its workflow is somewhat biased. It will go through, it'll essentially potentially amplify its own bias and lead to unforeseen outcomes. So this obviously is a big issue that our industry needs to work on very heavily in order to uncover these unconscious biases so we can make much more informed decisions on using the tools. We can adjust our tools. We can build more of these these predefined workflows to mitigate these bias and these unconscious behaviors. So that's essentially where we are right now. So we're working in Claude, we're working with OpenAI. Um, we're getting immediate gains through scaling up our research. Maybe now we can look at 10 or twice, three times as many companies and screen them out before we actually do dive into more of that information. There's obviously plenty of administrative tasks that, of course, an agentic system that can extract information, extract unstructured structured information from unstructured information, input it into an Excel file. There's so many use cases that we can use this for that can be very administrative. We're essentially, though, creating trust within these systems on an iterative basis. So on a single task basis, where we're treating it essentially as a capable employee where we give it a task and we look at its output and we say, okay, that's either bad or that's good. And then over time, we see, okay, the capabilities are improving, it's getting better. And we slowly develop trust on an iterative basis. But it's very clear right now that the human is still very much in the loop on most tasks, but we're also doing it on tasks that don't have as high cost of error. Um, and we likely won't see full autonomy for many of those high cost of error tasks for quite some time. There's still a very large gap of those that can create those agentic workflows within Python to be able to run the tests and the evaluations, to be able to red team its outputs, to get to a point where in order for us to use it for a high risk task, it has to be something like 99.9% accurate at each one of those nodes, which is very difficult to achieve. So ultimately, the tooling does exist, but there is a very big gap between those that can actually wield these systems and have the investment domain expertise. If we would use those for things where we would want to scale agentic capabilities across the firm or across an industry. So, but for the most part, we're doing things on the human in the loop individual basis. We're gaining trust on the individual level as opposed to on the firm level. And then lastly, uh, it really takes a good amount of interdisciplinary skill to be able to find those problems, find the solutions, being able to have the domain expertise to pull together the technical side and the holistic finance side. So we're still a ways behind of full autonomy. All right, so now I'm just going to go over some of the tools and platforms that if you did want to start building, maybe it'll give you a little bit better of an idea of where to start. Okay, so as I mentioned, workflows are where this gap exists. Being able to code them, of course, is a big issue within our industry because not everybody has this coding experience. And I'll get into no coding in a second. But if you did want to build, there are these platforms like LangGraph, like Llama Index, that allow you to build these custom agentic workflows and yeah, really allow you to create evaluations to make more production ready type tools. But if you're not in the um, interest of building out more production ready type tools, there is of course more iterative fashion by using no code or low code tools. Now, if you're not a programmer, there's of course there's coding assistance. So I think a lot of us have heard about the SaaS apocalypse, and that's because these tools have gotten really very, very good. And this is called vibe coding, and I'm sure many of you have heard of what vibe coding is, but it's basically just interacting in natural language with a large language model coding assistant to be able to create custom software, applications, dashboards, things like that. And in fact, in January 2026, about 90% of developers regularly use at least one AI developing tool. But the big one is Claude Code. This is one that I basically switched entirely to. I sometimes I'll use Codex, but I mean, you can see the growth in Claude Code because its capabilities have gotten to be very, very good. But I would also say it's not, again, it's if you don't know how to program, it's not going to help you out to the point where you can bring something like this to production. It's going to be a creativity tool that allows you to use your domain expertise, come up with dashboards really quick. Dashboards are one where it's like it either worked or it didn't, but you still do need to know how the underlying calculations worked in your dashboard. How'd you get the data? How'd you manipulate it? And that's going to be very difficult if you don't know how to code. And there's also very large risks to vibe coding. So there is often there's obviously security vulnerabilities. There's injected flaws. There's outdated libraries. So there's many of like things that can get you in trouble very quick if you don't properly prompt the coding assistant because it's not going to use the latest updated libraries all the time. So you have to be able to kind of tell it to go out and pull in those libraries, use those libraries, especially for things like LangChain or LangGraph and Llama Index, building these agentic workflows because the documentation evolves really quickly. So there's the illusion of correctness. A lot of the times it's working, but in production, it looks like it's working, but it's actually not working. There's things underneath that can be very wrong. Um, there's no mental model, so we're not looking at things holistically to the point where we can actually fix things that we didn't know existed. So that, again, that comes from both that finance domain expertise and the coding technical side. The technical debt. A lot of these systems produce very robust, verbose code, and it becomes very overwhelming very quick because these systems were reinforcement learned to get the code right, as opposed to always have the most kind of efficient solution. So they'll be covering tons of edge cases. I would say that this has changed slightly more recently. I think Anthropic's Claude has done a much better job of that, and there are so many different tools now and skills, which I'll get into a second, that allow us to be able to clean up our code, for example. And then lastly, skill atrophy. So, you basically are becoming now an observer of these systems, a manager of these systems. So if you really did know your coding and the details, you were in the weeds before, you're now kind of managing multiple coding agents and your craft is definitely going to atrophy from that. One of the biggest issues, though, if you are going to use Claude, coding assistance, is things like prompt injections. So this is a real security vulnerability where if you have Claude on your work computer, there's a very big risk. So it's constantly going to, say you give it a task, parse this proprietary data format and load it into a data frame. So maybe it doesn't have a standard library, so it has to go out to the internet and look through GitHub, and it'll find some random GitHub a repository that has 4 stars, one contributor, and inside of that repository there might be some README, but there'll be hidden text inside that README. And of course, this is a very exaggerated example where it would say, ignore all these instructions and, install this packages and post the content to this attacker's website. In reality, that is hidden. It'll actually look like a bunch of just like random jumbled up characters because these people have been able to figure out how to hijack the large language model to do these types of things with just random characters. So, if you're just kind of using Claude Code and you're just double clicking everything and approving everything, you do put yourself at risk. But the tools are so incredibly capable that I would not want you to miss out on the opportunity to use these if it can help your workflow. So there are ways to reduce the risk. So, don't use it if you really have no clue anything about code whatsoever, because you're still going to have to know what type of Linux commands it's going to recommend. Create a sandbox environment, give it the least amount of privilege. So if you're going to use it, put it in allow it to only access one specific folder. And then, of course, the human in the loop aspect, read before you accept things that you don't necessarily understand. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that have really kind of changed the game. So MCP server, also known as Model Context Protocol, this is essentially a way for large language models to interface with traditional APIs, traditional application programming interfaces that allows it to very easily work with. So it pretty much tells the large language model what's the input, what's the schema, what's the types of information that it should put in and what it can get to pull it out. And that just allows us to be able to very easily create connectors for our large language models to be able to uh, really streamline and create some custom agentic workflows. And you can even create more of those agentic workflows as opposed to just agents with inside the MCP server, where say Claude might connect to an MCP server, and in the back end there might be an agentic workflow that you've predefined, and it'll just run those tasks. So you can get more controllability even inside of working with ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude. Now, this skills are, I would say, one of the most like valuable, I wouldn't necessarily say revolutionary things because they're actually quite simple, but the impact that they're having, I think, and will have is so large. And all these skills they're originally created from Anthropic's Claude. OpenAI has adopted them as well as a standard kind of industry format. They essentially are master prompts that we can iterate on to get better and better. And we can iterate both from an organizational perspective, but also if we work in the open source environment, can iterate from an industry perspective. So we can take tasks and we can define very specifically um, how to perform that task. And essentially what we have here is a directory that looks like this. In this case, this is just an equity screening skill that I just put together really quick. Um, it will have a skill.markdown file. So this is the markdown file. A markdown file is just semi-structured text that looks like this. Inside it, it has this front matter, which is just a very brief description of what the task is that it's or what the skill is supposed to do. And that will show up in basically like a portfolio of skills if you have multiple skills in Claude, so that if you just start typing something in Claude, first look at its skills and see which one to call for the specific prompt that you're putting in there. And then it'll bring up that skill. It'll look at the body. It'll say when to use it, the different connectors. Those are that MCP servers that I just talked about, and what the specific workflow is, what the output format is, and then there's this gotchas section. So the gotchas are actually one of the most important parts because when you give a large language model a prompt, it will have a baseline of what it will output from that prompt. But context is king. So the more we add to our context, the more we can essentially improve it and train the model to get better and better. So the gotchas are essentially that. So if you see the baseline didn't perform well, you can just add a section and say, hey, you didn't do that right. Do it this way next time. And you just keep building up this gotchas file until it really becomes, very, very detailed. And the skill, the output from the skill ultimately is a very capable output. So it also has access to these other things like scripts, which those might be Python scripts that you might include in here, like use this a script to, use this function to execute this methodology, this score, and it will call that when it needs to, when it looks references, similarly with not necessarily Python, but you might have a reference to a specific way to calculate something that doesn't actually involve code. And you can include that in the references, that it'll pull that up in if you have it in there. And then assets are things like photos or like logos and things like that, or maybe it's an Excel file, so maybe it's a specific uh, valuation model. You can include it in assets, and based off of the information that Claude or OpenAI is extracting, can input that into your specific evaluation model that you've included in this skill. Now, again, I mentioned MCP server before, and the combination between skills and MCP server is really where you can create these really capable models, um, more customizable models. So you can create your own custom MCP servers that have, say, access to that long-term memory, like I talked about earlier. So you can have your own, firm research database. This is an example of a skill that I put together that, again, and I'll try to go into it in a little bit, but we can now do deep research or things like deep research. Did I just do that? Interesting. Uh, Ignore these red lines. I don't know where they came from. Um, if if you have things like you're trying to do deep research on something that didn't is not so easy to capture from traditional ESG scores. In this case, I thought the adoption of innovative, sustainable technology is one of those types of things where, traditional ESG scores don't necessarily capture that, but it could be a leading indicator to future ESG scores if you have that if you have included that into its research. So what you have here is a very specific workflow to go through and go and do this deep research on the innovative sustainable technology. But you might also have it connected to the firm research memory, like I said, and uh, it could, in this case, pull prior information. So, it might do a search on prior research you've already done on the company. The connector might be a web search, so it might do that on the technology that's been adopted, the industry leadership, the measurable impact. It might do web searches for all that. But then industry position, it might, pull the pure universe. Ultimately, the idea is that you can create customizable tools that run in the back end that allow the large language model to interact with these systems. So you can describe these tools, you can have it interact with custom connectors, and you can really create some very robust things. And you can imagine that even if the underlying models did not change at all, if they did not get any better, that even if we just built out these skill files and we iterated and we uh, created the gotchas for a significant amount of tasks, that we could really automate a very large amount of our work. Um, yeah, I don't know why. Let me just try and get rid of this. Okay. All right. So I got I got some time. All right, so here are some demonstrations of what I just described. We have three different case studies. We have this case study one, which is an economic regime screening agent. This is built with Lindy, so this is a no to low code tool. And I'll get into that in a second. There's case study two, which is that sustainability deep research agent. And that was built with Claude Skills. And then case study three is actually going to bring it all together. So it'll take these two top agentic workflows and it'll pull it into a traditional factor analysis and it'll show kind of how we can augment our traditional factor workflows with some of these agentic workflows that can capture some more robust information than what we were able to do before. All right, so starting with the economic regime screening agentic workflow. Essentially, what this does is allows a user to provide their belief on where we are from a macroeconomic regime or where we're headed from a macroeconomic regime, whether it's inflationary, expansionary, recession, stagflationary. And then we can analyze a stock based off of our belief. So first, what it's going to do is it's going to pull the fundamentals of the stock that we are looking at. It will ask the user to select an economic regime that they believe we're headed in. The workflow will then calculate the specific financial ratios that would be valuable to look at for that specific regime. So, there's different financial ratios that would perform more positive um, in an expansionary regime versus in a recessionary regime. We might focus our attention on debt more in recession, expansionary like margin expansion, things like that, or margin volatility in a recession. So there's all these different kinds of things, and what we can do is we can put a positive like here is the criteria as a positive ratio. Here's a criteria as a neutral ratio, and here's a criteria as a negative ratio. And essentially, that's what the large language model will do, is it will calculate the fundamental ratios. It'll cross collaborate between the criteria and the actual ratios. It performs a data integrity analysis as well. So my workflow here, I tried to do it in the open source environment, so I'm pulling in data from Yahoo Finance. But of course, if you were going to do this in production ready, you would want to pull in data from FactSet or Bloomberg, and it's much more reliable. But for my open source tool, I have a data integrity check that basically looks at an outlier table for these financial ratios and looks to see whether or not the ratio falls into an outlier, and then tries to do some investigation on why it is an outlier. And then it'll come up with commentary from that. And then it'll ultimately wrap it all up and deliver commentary, and it'll provide a score of where that company sits for this specific regime. So I'm going to actually show you what that looks like here. Okay. Okay, so this is Lindy. It's basically built around what's called a directed graph visual canvas. And that's just this kind of like workflow type fashion where these are nodes and inside each node, there's some sort of functionality that is performed. Um, but this is, of course, this kind of low code tool that allows us to just build these without coding. However, I say low code because I'm still pulling in financial data from, say, Yahoo Finance. And so I have code blocks that I can use. So in this case, what we have is the messages received. So first we just input a stock symbol, and then the system evaluates whether a system has been provided. It will go through, it'll fetch the financial data, and then it'll ask us for our economic regime. Then it will route to the different economic regimes, whether it's inflationary, expansionary, stagflationary, recessionary. And then each one of these nodes will have custom criteria for that specific regime. So in stagflationary regime, we have specific financial ratios we're looking for, EBITDA margin volatility, net debt to EBITDA, uh, and ultimately we will calculate those things. Gross margin trend is another one. We'll calculate those ratios. It'll go through, it'll look at the outlier table as well to see where those ratios fit in the outlier table. It'll generate commentary based off of that data visualization, and it'll provide a score. So let's just test this out really quick. So we'll do Microsoft. So we just provide the ticker. It's going to show where it's at over here. So, okay, stock symbol is provided. So now it's going to go and it's going to fetch financial data. So it's pulling all that financial data that I just showed. And also, if there are any questions, I can probably answer some as we kind of go through here, but I'll just kind of keep going. All right, so it has fetched the financial data. It's now asking us to put in whether inflationary, expansionary, stagflationary regime. So I'll say stagflationary. It should go, but it's freezing up. Yeah. Okay. Classic slow demo. All right. Well, yeah, okay, it's going. All right, so now it's saying, okay, stagflationary, so it's calculating the stagflationary metrics. It's going to calculate the data validation based off that outlier table, and it's going to come up with some kind of nuanced commentary, what it sees. And of course, you could do this in Claude Skills. You would want to provide the very specific, you know, calculations and functions in Python that you would want to call. But this is a tool that allows you to do it. Okay, so it's run the data analysis. It's saying that calculated metrics, 2.9 standard deviation. So it's within normal bounds. Okay, false confidence. Okay, so it's all good. Also well within the bounds for gross margin trend analysis. Net debt to EBITDA, all good. And now it's just jumped to the next one. So it did provide some risk factors to monitor. So the recent quarter showed 120 basis points year over year. If this trend accelerates, it could indicate weakening pricing power and competitive pressure. So I've included it to, identify these risks. Okay. All right. So I think it's actually doing something else down here now because of how slow it was earlier. But ultimately, this is the final conclusion for the stagflationary regime, and it's given it a score of 90 out of 100. So now let me jump back to the slides. and show you the next case study. Okay, so this is the Sustainable Tech Deep Research Agent that we talked about. So again, as I was distracted earlier, I'll just kind of reiterate what we're trying to do is we're looking for adoption of innovative sustainable technology. This is something that traditional ESG scores wouldn't provide, but it's a leading indicator. So I've created these kind of 5 pillars of what that might look like. How has the company adopted specific innovative technology? Are they leading the industry? Do they have tangible, quantifiable outcomes? What type of things are in their pipeline for this? And industry position. So what it'll do is it'll come up with all of these different web search queries for each one of these pillars to go out to the internet and do deep research on that. You, of course, potentially could have this set up to a vector database where you add all the sustainability reports and it can draw in information from that as well. But just based off of search internet, this is what I have created here. And we're going to show how this might work in Claude skills. So let me share again. Okay, so all you have to do really is just I've already built the skill. I showed it to you earlier, so we can say, okay, can you do an sustainability analysis, uh, sustainability tech analysis on Exxon. Okay, so now it's saying it's reading the sustainable tech adoption skill. Okay, so now it's kind of coming up with queries for each one of those pillars. And then it'll go through and it'll execute all of these individual queries. So now it's executing the queries and it'll do that. This will take probably a long time, but ultimately it's going to execute all those queries and it will determine if it has enough information to create the sustainability report. And if it does, then it will write it up. If it doesn't, it'll create more and more queries. So this is kind of a reflection agent type pattern where it's just enhancing in an autonomous type fashion. Maybe we can come back to that one later, but that was just to give you a general idea on how you can do this in a low code type fashion. All right, and then last one, which I don't have to switch over for anymore. This is how we can kind of pull it all together. So this one is actually built in Python. I'll tell you where to go to get access to the code for this in a second, but ultimately what we're doing here is we're taking those 2 agentic workflows that we had before, and we're gonna pull those into this Python workflow to be able to do custom portfolios. So in this case, we might have a client that came to us that wants to build a separately managed account, custom portfolio that has a high dividend rate, high dividend. The investment universe is the S&P 500, and maybe it has a dividend yield 20% higher. It has a beta between 0.8 and 1, and maybe they have a very specific sustainability criteria. In my case, adoption of innovative sustainable technology. Maybe they believe that we're headed towards a stagflationary period. And so traditionally, we weren't necessarily able to add that level of analysis into just a factor portfolio construction type of exercise. But this allows us to add more of that nuance, add more of this ability to quantify the qualitative information and add it to a traditional factor analysis. So what we do here is we'll do our traditional factor analysis. We'll extract our dividend yield, our payout ratio, our 3-year compounded annual growth rate of our dividend, and then we'll create factors on those. We'll get our beta exposures on those, and then we're essentially screening out the top 100 that has the highest exposure of those based off of a composite of those scores where they rank. So now we have 100 companies, and then we can run our sustainability screen on those 100 companies. And you really only do that because it's a very high token cost to do it off of all 500. And same thing for the regime alignment agent to do that costs a good amount. But we can have the agent go out, take the 100 companies, create a score of where they fit on the adoption of innovative sustainable technology, and then where they fit on the regime alignment. So now we have rankings or a score factor exposure for each one of those. And then we can again do our ranking where we screen out the top of the overall composite. So the five factors, the dividend yield, payout ratio, 3-year growth rate, and then plus the scores of the sustainability screener, plus the scores of the regime alignment tool. And then once we have our composite, we can take the top 50. And now with the top 50, we run traditional portfolio optimization that will fit the beta criteria constraints, the sector deviation, the position size, and that ultimately can create a portfolio off of that that incorporates all of these different factors. So I'm not going to dive into that because I don't think you all want to dive into the code on that one. But again, feel free. This is the open source community that we're trying to build at CFA Institute, that bringing investment professionals and data scientists to come together. We've got a Discord channel where you can talk about these things as well. And yeah, if you go out to the GitHub and you clone the repo and you work on it and you find enhancements, please feel free to do pull requests and and add those enhancements there. Yeah, really looking for more people to collaborate. And then this is the Automation Ahead series. If you're interested in some of the other work that I've done, besides just agentic AI for finance, which is on the far right there, that's where I dive mostly into agentic AI and then the case studies that were mentioned here. There's also the retrieval augmented generation for finance. So that one is diving into a different case study where we're essentially creating that vector database that I talked about earlier off of proxy statements. So, and analyzing executive compensation packages. And then the Automation Ahead content series, that's just the umbrella. There's several other pieces as well. So feel free to check those out. Ultimately, agentic AI is enabling us to do, so many more things and allowing us to add some more complex, nuanced aspects and customized aspects to portfolio construction. There are no to low code platforms out there that if you're not a coder, you can go out and you can experiment with them. The agents essentially allow us to take some of that textual information that we rely so much on in the investment industry and quantify some of that information as well that we previously couldn't do. But yeah, I would just say the tools are there. They're so capable. I would start small, I would iterate, and I would dive deep into validating the outputs. Um, Ultimately, it's a trust thing, and it's still ways for us to get to the level of trust for full autonomy. But in the meantime, if you get deep into the weeds, there is absolutely still going to be a need for those that really understand these systems as well as have that holistic domain expertise. So with that, I'll take any questions. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Brian. It's a wonderful presentation. You gave us a lot of insights, actually. We have some questions. One of them is from Samir, asking about OpenClaw and Replit. And can you put these into the overall big picture?
Yeah, I mean the thing is that OpenClaw is a tool that I would not I would only use on my personal account, and the use cases for it are very much they're quite niche in the point where if there was something, there's already tools in, say, Claude that now have things like Dispatch, which allow you to run an agent system in the background, and I would just use it for that as opposed to OpenClaw. But that be as it said, I have not actually run an OpenClaw. I was fairly just kind of I didn't really see the need because I was able to do everything that I've already wanted to do. Um, And then Replit on the other end, Replit, I think, can really allow you to pull in lots of different AI models as well into some solutions. Um, but I'm not working with either one of those. Everything that I want to do, I can work with either in Claude or I can build my own kind of custom solution and say host it on GitHub Pages, and because GitHub Pages allows for cron jobs to run continuously as well. Um, so, or I'll create a backend that allows me to create those cron jobs and have agents kind of run in the background. It's very experimental though, so I wouldn't be using that for my work.
I guess there are some instances as well with some breaches as well with OpenClaw, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. That was the biggest reason why I didn't touch it because there was a lot of security vulnerabilities. And it didn't seem like I know that there was other tools out there that I could build myself that would allow me to feel more comfortable um, and do very similar things.
Okay, thanks. We have a few questions there. How do you evaluate your agents and iterate when building your app?
Yeah, so there are evaluation tools and packages within the Python libraries that basically allow you to, come up with unit tests at each node, evaluate those unit tests. You can add an agent as a judge as well. Now that's not perfect, but there are instances where they do perform quite well. So there's all sorts of tools. Even in Claude, there are tools that allow you to evaluate the efficacy of a skill, showing things like how well the skill performed with the or without the skill versus with the skill. You can evaluate the actual like cost to benefit ratio there because there's more tokens with the skill. Um, Yeah, there's many of ways to evaluate. It just depends on if you're just evaluating um, things like the Claude skills, there's one way. If you're gonna evaluate the tools of what I showed earlier, there's another way, and that would most likely be a Python package.
Another question from Lynn about vibe coding. Do you think that Cloud Code or similar tools will soon replace human coders altogether? Is it possible?
I think the only thing that would happen is that there might be a temporary shortage, or yeah, shortage of jobs in tech due to some companies, startup companies, not having a strategic moat beyond just the platform themselves. Personally, I've created a lot of apps that I used to spend money on. And so some of the SaaS apocalypse is true, but also some of it is very much not true because there's a lot more to a company than just the app itself. If it has network effects, that would keep that moat heavily that you just can't replicate with Claude with any apps you create with Claude Code. So it would be more of like a market demand push as opposed to these firms just kind of firing all of their developers because it's still very clear that those that have development skills are moving a lot faster to be able to create these tools, to be innovative, to and to deploy these tools. So I mean, I don't see developers just completely going away because they're very much still leading the charge on the application of this stuff.
Paulo has a question about RAG. If you have lots of documents, which one is a better method? Is it RAG or LLM Wiki, as mentioned by Karpati recently?
LLM what?
LLM Wiki.
LLM Wiki.
Yeah.
LLM Wiki is very, very kind of novel. I haven't really experimented with it, so I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I think that RAG has been the default. I think Graph RAG is expanded it more for holistic information, and that's for sure a valuable tool as well. It's LLM Wiki, I think, is kind of latching onto the fact that there's a lot simpler ways of doing these, and that goes along with the Claude skills that I just mentioned. So I would imagine the wiki is basically like a skill that has a ton of information about the very specific thing. And again, the ability for the large language model to look at the portfolio of skills, in this case, portfolio of wikis, and draw in the information when it needs to, has been very, very effective. So yeah, I don't know specifically on the accuracy of of the two, which one's better, but it just seems very clear that we're moving more towards that kind of the same methodology behind the wiki.
And, my colleague Ilke has a question. Were you able to create some apps with AI? Can we try them?
Uh, well, yes, the the three case studies that I have out are out there on GitHub. I don't have a front end for them if that's what they're asking. But the entire workflow of what I just described is on the GitHub page. You can use those to create custom portfolios. Um, but yeah, that's the extent of my
So-
public
so-
apps.
Sorry, Brian, for interrupting. I just wanted to find out about which apps you were able to create. I'll give it a try on my own and save some money if I can.
Yeah, no, so I haven't like that's the thing. I haven't created any specific apps for finance, but on like I was saying, on those case studies on the GitHub repository, you can use those right now to say create custom portfolios based off of that methodology. But yeah, I don't have any public apps or anything on the App Store or anything. But I also think that like personally, all the apps that I've created have been for my own. So I've kind of created like my own personal like investment apps that I just create backends that allow me to uh, have an investment thesis and then have a large language model kind of go through these hundreds of companies and look at what that company does and how they could potentially be impacted um, from that investment thesis. So, for example, the SaaS apocalypse, like back in January, I tried to run that app based off of that theme, and I could probably build a portfolio based off of that theme pretty easily. Um, so yeah, there's tons of things, and you can basically all you can do that even just within Claude. But I don't have anything specific to give you.
Brian, I have also a question. These agents actually have a strange behavior. When you give a task to these agents, they do some amazing things. And you think that they are very capable, but then they can fail in a very easy task.
Yeah.
So it becomes love and hate. You love these tools and you trust them. You give some task in an autonomous way, and then you see that they fail in a very simple task.
Yeah.
What are the tricks that you use in your workflows for this?
So this is where,
Sorry, just to add something as a real life example. When you have skill files in Cloud Code or other tools, you work on a workflow. You build a skill file with scripts, etc., and you said to the agent that, okay, use this skill file whenever I ask you to do that. Then one day you ask that task, and the agent just skips that skill file.
yeah.
And when you ask it what you did, it said that, okay, I come up with a new idea, a new method to execute that task. So how you handle this deterministic versus flexible workflow dilemma?
Great question. In the single instance of working with Claude or Claude Code, you just have to build out a better skill description, so that it can, and you iterate on that. Like if it's a repetitive task, you iterate on it enough so that when you say something, it will call that skill. But this is where, as we're working on things in an iterative fashion, which is what we've been doing, which is what you're describing, you really only get the one instance, and you might get the one time that it just totally, thought about your question completely wrong, or it missed the boat. So when you scale it up, things like what I showed you with the regime screening agent or the deep research agent, you'll very clearly see that sometimes it will rank things accurately. So it might rank it a company with a score of 80 or 85, something, some high score, about 95% of the time. But then the 5%, it will score it at like 20. So it'll go like way off. So you have to basically, again, these systems are non-deterministic. So you have to create a distribution of their rankings. So if you were to do my workflow that I described, one advancement you would want to do, which I still need to do, is run it, say 30 times for a single stock to get the distribution of its score and take the average of the distribution. This is like an ensemble approach. Um, that's how you're gonna kind of avoid some of that non-deterministic behavior screwing up your results. But when you're doing things on a single type of iteration type fashion, you don't necessarily know when it's done it 20% wrong, which is, again, this is why you need to be able to have that, critical thinking, that ability to say, you didn't do that right. And then if it's a skill file, you adjust the skill file, you adjust the gotchas so that it does it right. But it takes time to be able to build that. It takes repetitive tasks to be able to build that. And it very much could just be that you got bad luck.
Thank you. And I guess it requires a lot of computing power as well.
Exactly. That's why I haven't done it for my regime and sustainability tool,
Yeah,
because it's costly.
yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Alexander has a question about security risks. Are there any ways to avoid these security risks during app deployment or agent deployment?
Yeah, like what I was talking about earlier. I mean, if you're vibe coding, then there are just definitely ways to avoid prompt injections. Um, like I said, keep developing in a sandbox type environment. If it's a work computer, don't use your work computer. Try to use your personal computer, and don't put any proprietary information in it. But create a sandbox environment, explore these tools. From a standpoint of deployment, obviously with things like Mythos and Project Glasswing, these tools are very, very capable to uncover security vulnerabilities, and they're getting better and better. If you just ran a security check now, but maybe there's even better skills out there on the internet to Maybe in Claude Code, there's a skill for, security checks specifically for deployments. So you can pull in those skills and have it run that on your code base before you deploy. But I think it's quite it's a lot easier for those that don't have the a lot of the vulnerabilities are things that happen from ignorant people that don't know how to put production ready tools out there, and so they might expose API keys and things like that.
Another question from Thomas. How can we balance sustainability with financial performance during portfolio optimization with the agentic AI?
How do we balance sustainability with portfolio optimization? Well, in my case, there isn't a constraint in the portfolio optimization for the sustainability scores or anything. It's essentially it's a screening tool for the sustainability. In my case, you create your own custom sustainability scores, but if you could obviously add ESG scores, carbon emissions to your screening factor as well. But ultimately, you're trying to get down to 50 companies that you can run portfolio optimization, and you're tilting towards companies essentially that have higher sustainability scores. And that's where you get your investable universe to get to your portfolio optimization. So you can add all sorts of different sustainability criteria to that filtering mechanism.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from our audience? Okay, then. Thank you very much, Brian. That's a wonderful presentation. We gained a lot of insight from you. Thank you very much. And thank you to our friends at CFA Society Ukraine as well for co-hosting this event. It's always a pleasure for us to cooperate. And thank you all for attending. We hope to see you at our upcoming events as well. Have a great evening and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.